Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I see that folks are starting to load into the room, and we'll be getting started in just a moment. So in the interest of everyone's time, I just want to get us going on this. I know Larry has a lot of information to share with us, but I'll start this off by welcoming everyone, thanking you for joining us. My name is Cindy Bonnier. I'm the President CEO of the Fremont Chamber of Commerce. And today we are going to talk about California's economic roadmap. And with us, we have Lenny Mendonca, who is the former Chief Economic and Business Advisor to Governor Gavin Newsom and the Director of Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, otherwise known as GoBiz. He's a Senior Partner Emeritus at McKinsey and Company and a lecturer of inequality at the Stanford Business School. And I got to tell you, did I say Larry?
You did.
I'm so sorry. It's Lenny. I don't know where that came from. I just got a message from Matt saying, hello. But Lenny, we're so glad to have you. Couple other things that I think are really interesting about Lenny's background is that he founded McKinsey's U.S. state and local public sector consulting practice. He also oversaw their knowledge department, chairing the McKinsey Global Institute and the firm's communications, including the McKinsey Quarterly. He served for a decade on the McKinsey Shareholder Council and its board of directors, and he retired in 2014. He holds an MBA and certificate in public management from Stanford, and he holds an AB from magna cum laude in economics from Harvard. So quite a smart guy. But some of the things that I thought were especially interesting too is he lives on the coast, Half Moon Bay, where he also owns a Half Moon Bay Brewing Company. So Lenny is a well-rounded guy for sure. And at some point, I think there's so much more that Lenny has in his bio. So I think we're going to post that in the chat room so you can take a look at that too. He certainly is an expert in many things. So with that, I want to welcome you, Lenny. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks.
Let's just do a couple of housekeeping things. You will have the opportunity, attendees, to ask Lenny some questions. We're going to go through some conversation with Lenny to start with. If you have a question and you want to raise your hand, please do so, and then we will call on you. Or you may also leave your question in the chat room and we'll ask it for you. Either one is acceptable for that. So to get started, boy, have we had quite the year behind us. Now I think we're heading into what, 14 months of this now. And tell us your just thoughts about the last 14 months, Lenny, if you would.
Sure, Cindy, and it's great to be with you. I know we were trying to schedule a time to speak with each other for a little while now, and fortunately we got the time scheduled. And don't worry about calling me Larry. Just a quick sidelight. The first editorial I wrote for the Wall Street Journal, they emailed me back and forth to make sure they had my name spelled right. And I kept sending my last name, and they got it right, except they published it as Lenny Mendonca. So don't feel a difference. So
I'm not alone. Okay, good to know.
So, listen, this has obviously been a tumultuous time in the last year and a half as we were entering the first quarter, even the first 2 months, full 2 months of 2020. The state was on a record string of months of job creation. We were at all-time record lows for unemployment. Investment was surging. The first 2 months in terms of business activity, in terms of job creation, in terms of the stock markets, just in terms of the general consumer attitudes were, at all-time highs, and we were trucking along. And so a lot of what we were talking about at that time was how do we keep this going? And then obviously the global pandemic hit and turned everything upside down. And there, as you all know, there has not been that steep a decline in economic activity and jobs, even since the Great Depression. That was prolonged, but it didn't happen in one quarter. It spread out over quite a few years. It took much longer to recover. So it is a unique circumstance, and one that, even the best prognosticators couldn't see coming. It happened really quickly, and then there was as it was happening, an enormous amount of uncertainty and in many cases misinformation about what was actually going on. And so it was, for a while there, it wasn't clear what the bottom was going to be. And we can talk about what it was like in that time period as you're trying to make decisions on behalf of the residents of California, a bit if you'd like. But we're now clearly on the recovery end of this. Had a massive federal response, both from monetary policy, fiscal policy, and obviously a Sputnik level response to developing and getting vaccines out, which is truly impressive. And since this was a pandemic-induced recession, there was nothing leading up to it that gave any indication that we were entering a downturn. But my top line is that we are going to see a very rapid and sustained recovery, and it will vary by sector. But I think we will be back in an environment where we were feeling great about how things were 14 months ago. So it's a horrible time period, not the least of which is obviously the pain and suffering and loss of life that happened here and elsewhere and is still happening, and deeply problematic in places like India and parts of South America. But in the United States and in California, we're, knock on wood, absent some other thing that comes at us that we don't see coming, we're clearly on the upswing.
Yeah. Oh, great to hear that. Let's step back a minute, because it seemed like one minute we were, everything seemed rosy in our future, and then bam, everything was closed. I mean, I remember when it closed, I was in San Francisco the day they announced it, and I swear you could have rolled a bowling ball down market and not hit a thing. So can you just kind of walk us through the conversations and the decision making that happened leading up to the pandemic? Like, what was the time? What did it look like during your conversations about what this is going to be moving forward?
No, it did happen very, very rapidly. And I remember doing a radio interview with KQED on the Friday that I was in the middle of the interview, and one of the interviewers stepped aside to take a call from her daughter, who's in elementary school, saying they were going to close the school that day, and she had to figure out what to do with her the next day. And so, that was someone who was deeply aware of what was going on, and it took a lot of us by surprise. So there were obviously discussions and decision making happen at all different levels. Federal level at that point, we're largely taking hands off in terms of very specific guidance. The CDC and others were still trying to get good data on what the disease was like. The early indications at that point from public health officials and scientists were really, really bad. The reads out of China were that this was, in non-technical terms, extremely contagious and extremely lethal. And you put those two together, and if you're in the middle of trying to figure out what to do about this and you don't have great information, it was truly frightening. And so you had officials, public health officials in particular, at counties and at the state level, and trying to coordinate cross-state, especially in places where states were close to each other, and there was intra-state activity going on. So what do you do? And at that time, if you remember, we were looking at things like what the information coming out of China was like in the early days of what was going on in Italy. And without action, we were deeply worried that the public health consequences were going to look like what they are in India right now. That would be extraordinarily painful, deep spread that would overwhelm our healthcare system and leave many people sick and many unable to get the kind of care that they needed, and many not able to survive it. And if you also remember at that time, the early cases in the United States that were more visible were in convalescent homes in Washington State, and then in Manhattan, and more broadly New York City, where there was deep concerns about their capacity to deal with it. This was happening at the same time that many of the technology companies in particular who had exposure in China and perspective on it and were quickly saying they were going to go fully remote and tell everybody not to show up at work because they were worried about the same kind of data. So when we were in the middle of these discussions, the discussion was really about public safety and health. First and foremost, almost period stop. It was, how do we ensure that we do not have a massive spread that we cannot contain and that millions of people are going to get sick and hundreds of thousands are going to die. And so how you do that in a really complicated place like the state of California and do it as best you can, as rapidly as you can, while minimizing the consequences of it when you have incomplete information, is an extraordinarily difficult task. And I will say, having been in the middle of all of those conversations about what was going on, there was zero conversation about politics. It was all about how do we do what's right for the citizens, with the primary focus being on public health.
Oh, it's interesting. So now that hindsight's 2020, do you think there was ever an overreaction to it, or is there something that should have been done differently? Or did we learn? What did we learn from that whole process?
I think we are still learning, and there is and should be continued adaptation of what we do based on that knowledge. So as an example, the early days, if you remember, the CDC guidance was not to wear masks. And that was in part because there was a shortage of personal protective equipment, and they were trying to make sure that there wasn't a run on masks that prevented healthcare professionals and essential workers from having them. But it's very clear now that that's one of the, especially high quality masks, one of the best preventive measures that we can have. So if anything, knowing what we know now, if we had the supplies, we should have insisted that everyone wear masks from the beginning.
Yeah.
And we have much better knowledge now about the nature of spread and who is most likely to get it and who is most likely to be suffering severe consequences from it. So we didn't know at the time that you had some indication from early data from China that it was particularly problematic for people older than certain ages or who had pre-existing health conditions. But there was no data coming out of China really about its impact on children. So we didn't know that either.
Yeah.
And then we had an expectation there was going to be a consistent and substantial federal response, particularly as it relates in the early days to providing personal protective equipment. That was not coming. There was a massive shortage of testing. So it was really testing supplies, even from the level of nasal swabs, that was really difficult to get a factual understanding of what was going on and isolate and contain as best you could during different circumstances. And then lastly, how you think about what it is that is allowed to do and not allowed to do. If we have all the data that we have now, we could be more precise on exactly what was allowed and what was not allowed. At the moment in time, when there was the really substantial short-term activity, the single objective was to slow the spread. And that meant we had to take extreme measures. And if anything, I think that when you look back, we will find that California was wise to have done that. And that if anything, we probably should not have reopened as quickly as we did in some early stages, because we had another surge as a result of that. I mean, the final thing I'd say is, there's some of this that you can promulgate as executive action or legal action at different levels of government. California is a big, complicated state, and the situation in Los Angeles County was very different than the situation in the rural north or the portions of the Bay Area. So you had to leave a little bit of flexibility for that. But in addition, this was the biggest actions that made a difference on the pandemic were human behavior. And you really don't know what humans are going to do until you're in the middle of it. And it's really different behavior in different places. And so having some consistency and saying, if anything, we're going to encourage people to overreact, because in the first instance, we'd rather have people be extra precautious and more worried to ensure that they're safe than taking it as something that wasn't serious and just like the flu. So again, I think there'll be books and books written on what we could and should have done differently after the fact. And those will be important to learn because it probably won't be the last one. And it'll be important to understand that better in the future.
Sure, I understand. Let's talk a little bit about some of the economic impact, though, that from COVID. You talked earlier about you think there will be, once we are in a better position to open, or now that we see the light at the end of the tunnel, we'll see a rapid recovery. I actually agree. I think we're going to see a lot of new stores, new opportunities open, and things like that. But what do you think are going to be the long-term effects? I mean, we see all these grants going out. Idle loans are higher probably than ever. The PPP, everything else. It's like, where's this money coming from, and what's going to be the long-term effect of all those things?
Yeah, well, we are already seeing a rapid recovery. The GDP in the first quarter grew at 6.4%, which is the fastest in any quarter since 1984. Expectations from most economic forecasters are that 2020 will be above 4%, which will be higher than it's been since the 1990s. And with the Federal Reserve in particular continuing to signal that and be explicit that it is going to keep rates low until there's sustained and broad, widespread low unemployment, that I think we will still see a fiscal and monetary environment in the United States that's promoting growth. Now, obviously, if there is another wave, if there's another variant that the vaccines don't protect, if there's a massive slowdown outside the United States, as is already happening in India, if it happens elsewhere, those could be problematic about that. But in the meantime, the reason that the economy has recovered as rapidly as it did is first and foremost, obviously, because of the decline in spread of the virus, the treatment, most importantly, vaccines, that allowed more and more of the economy to open and people to interact. But it was also from a massive and extraordinarily rapid monetary and fiscal response. When we were in the early days of this, we were in close communication with both the Federal Reserve and Congress and the executive branch about what we were seeing and how bad it was. And monetary policymakers reacted extraordinarily quickly with just about everything they had. It took a little bit longer for the first round of stimulus to happen, but that made a big difference. And a large part of the growth in the first quarter of this year was because of the passage of the American Rescue Act in the early days of 2021. Those are going to continue to be important. We're going to need sustained support. And at a moment, one of the biggest mistakes in the Great Depression is that there was no fiscal stimulus. If anything, and the Federal Reserve wasn't in place to do this. There was a view that the thing we should be doing is tightening, and that made it worse. And so we do need that kind of activity. And then the next wave of investment is going to have to be paid for. We're going to have to find ways through both private investment as well as, I believe, a targeted set of tax increases to fund whatever's necessary to sustain this recovery. There's also a belief that part of what happened in the pandemic reaction from businesses has the chance to help create a more substantial and broad spread productivity improvement, particularly in some large sectors like retail and healthcare and construction that have not been seen dramatic, and education potentially, have not seen increases in productivity at any scale that could help bring a more sustained recovery even as monetary and fiscal stimulus subsides. The last thing I'd say is that it's very clear that many sectors of the economy moved extraordinarily rapidly to remote work. That is probably the most pronounced effect that's going to happen because of the pandemic on the economy, how people work, how they shop, how they eat, what are they willing to do or not do and can do remotely. What does that do to commute patterns? What does it do to public transit? What does it do to where people want to live? What does it do to the spread of where people are able to be employed relative to having to commute to a central location? All those are really profound impacts on the economy that we will see as the economy opens more back up. And then the last thing I'd say is in California in particular, but more broadly across the country, large sectors of the economy that were not able to work remotely. It's a little hard to eat a meal in a restaurant remotely. It is hard to go to a baseball game or opera remotely. It's actually reasonably difficult to make movies remotely. And in California, that has a very high concentration of businesses in the retail, hospitality, and visitor supporting businesses. When you've cut off international travel, when you don't have business conferences, when restaurants are challenged to begin with, it's really hard to have employment in a lot of those sectors. And those will come back. They'll come back at different paces. California has a very large and very well supported travel and tourism industry. The expectation is that from the latest numbers, the projections that I saw, which are consistent with what I'm seeing on the ground, is that consumer travel will actually be back to 2019 levels, maybe even this year, but certainly next year. The amount of pent up demand for people who are stir crazy and want to take that vacation this year and get away, or if you postponed your wedding, 1 year is a long time, and people are going to get married, and so you will see more travel. You'll also probably see more domestic travel than international travel because of travel restrictions, which means that a place like California, which is a very substantial destination for visitors, the Bay Area being an important part of that, but also has a major budget to promote travel and tourism, will be focused on, if you're in California, continue to vacation in California and shop local. And if in promotion to outside of California, they'll be encouraging people to visit California. My marker for a long time of where we are on the recovery path is when Disneyland opened. And when anyone who was trying to get tickets to Disneyland, when it was only open to Californians and had to wait online for 10 hours, you can see why there's pent up demand, and that will be coming back. Business travel is going to take longer, partly because of the adaptation to remote work, but also because there's still going to be a little while before people do large international and business conventions, although some of that's coming back. There's going to be a 5,000 person SaaS conference in San Mateo in the fall. Salesforce is saying they're going to do Dreamforce again this year. Those things will make a big difference, and you'll start to see people reopening or new businesses opening in those sectors, and you'll start to see occupancy rates in hotels and getting a seat and a table in a restaurant being better. And that's really important because the combination of retail, restaurants and hospitality, travel and tourism, and the creative economy, all of the production and distribution of films and movies and concerts and sporting events caused more than 1.2 million job losses in California. So those are big deals. And that's not just in Los Angeles, it's everywhere across the state.
Wow. So you mentioned remote work, and that's actually a big point of conversation I have, not only with my colleagues, but also my friends. And we're talking about I've heard both sides of the coin, that people are more productive and it gives them the freedom, and we don't spend that 2 hours sitting in traffic, as all positive things. But then I've also heard the other side of the coin that says there's no accountability, there's no the productivity is dropping, and then also the camaraderie between coworkers is dropping. Where do you think that when we recover and are able to return to our offices, what do you think? What do you see happening there? Do you see most people going back to work or continuing to work remote?
I think it's still to be seen, and there'll be differences by industry sector because of the nature of what their work is. There'll be differences by company based on how they think about it and what the nature of their business is. And there'll be differences, importantly, even within the same industry and the same company by the type of job you're doing.
Yeah.
My expectation is that we are never going to go back to, no, I shouldn't say never. We are not in any time soon going to go back to everyone's in the office 5 days a week and commuting. It's just not going to happen. What's been shown in this downturn is both of what you said are true. There's large portions of time that can be saved. There is, commuting an hour and a half in a single family car is nothing but dead weight loss and bad for the economy, bad for the environment, and bad for the communities and families where people are spending 2 hours or more in wasted time. So if we can eliminate that or reduce it, that's a good thing. But there is real value in collaboration, in teamwork, in culture building, in the mentoring that is important to do partly in person, and being able to have real connection to the workplace as opposed to your computer screen. So my guess is that we're going to end up in a much more of a hybrid situation in most places. I think the expectation for people in jobs that were able to be remote to be back 5 days a week in the office is going to be rare. But I also think that the 5 days a week never going into the office is going to be rare as well. And that will have big implications for things like, what does office space look like? How much do you need? What's going to occur in that office space? It's going to have big implications for the transit systems, for transportation more generally. And it's going to have really interesting implications about the geography of jobs. I am a believer that if done properly, this can be extremely good for the economy of California and more broadly for portions of the state and the country that have not been advantaged by being proximate to some hubs of innovation and economic activity in places like San Francisco and Los Angeles and San Diego here, or in New York or Boston. If we're commuting 2.5 hours a day or 2 hours a day, sitting on Highway 101 for 45 minutes to drive to a tower on just off the highway to go into your office and make inside sales calls, why are you doing that? Why couldn't you do that closer to where you live, where you would get those 2 hours, 2.5 hours back? You'd save all that gas or commuting expense. You'd have more time with your family or community, and you'd be probably a lot happier because you don't have to deal with all that stress. So I think that's the potential to have more distributed work can be really beneficial for places who have been less on the center of hubs of economic activity. I think it's going to create real challenges for places like downtown San Francisco. Going to have to think really hard about, what is going to make that really attractive? What does it do to a tax base that's very dependent on a lot of that economic activity? But it could be very good for places that are slightly further out. I spent a lot of time when I was in the governor's office looking at what can we do to help revitalize and spread the economic benefits of the state to the center part of the state and to the Inland Empire. And I think done right, this remote work move can have some real potential positive effects on that. Done wrong, it could be, hollowing out of our cities one more time, or spreading activity into places that have much lower cost of living and have talent pools that are strong as well. So it's not something that you can just take for granted, but I think it's that's probably the most pronounced effect's going to be what happens to distributed work.
That's good. And actually, that's a perfect segue into, my next question is, there's been a lot of chatter about the exodus out of California. Folks who are now able to work remotely, moving to cheaper areas, or maybe more rural or not in the city. That conversation about the California exodus has really intensified in the recent months. So what is your take on this exodus, or the so-called exodus? Is it real? Is it fake news? Is it politically motivated? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I just put in the chat box my Twitter handle. And if you know what I think, follow me on Twitter, because I comment a lot on this there, mostly with the hashtag Exodus hype. What is going on is fundamentally about pandemic-induced remote work, not about an exodus. And so the issues around the demography of California, the aging of the population, fewer immigrants from outside the country and a slight shift from immigration within the country to be more out than in is not something that is new, and it's not something that is dramatically altered from the pandemic. What's actually happened is that people are moving, have moved, and potentially temporarily from some of the urban centers to slightly more away from it. So if you have friends or you are spending any time in Lake Tahoe, you know that there's a boom there. That's mostly from people who are living in there and still working in jobs that were in the Bay Area or in Sacramento. All the press about people moving and companies moving to Texas and North Carolina and Florida are just pure hype. They're anecdotes repeated over and over again. Most people who move within their same state and move close counties. 3 times as many people move from the city of San Francisco to Santa Cruz County as move from the entire Bay Area to Florida. I mean, they're just different scales of what's going on. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not to say that all the questions about what we were talking about earlier around remote work and what that does are not really important questions. So you will see people moving back in because that's where their jobs are. Importantly, what's not appreciated is particularly in places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York and Boston, there are very large concentrations of students who have not been in town, because of the colleges being remote. And if you put the fact that there were no hotel jobs, very few hotel jobs, restaurants, all the jobs that I described earlier, what were people going to be doing? And so that's what's happened. We will see how that all plays out. But the idea that everyone's suddenly fleeing California is just not borne out by the facts. Secondly, while this has been going on, under those headlines of repeated over and over again the same anecdotes, the fact is that the movement of headquarters of companies has a negligible impact on jobs in the entire country. They're few and they're far between. Much more important is the continued creation and growth of newer companies and the expansion of those companies that are always there. And on that front, California, if anything, is even stronger coming through what's been happening in the pandemic-induced recession. Just a few stats, because I kind of tend to believe in data a little bit more than journalists writing the same anecdotes. In 2020, 440,000 Californians started a new business. That's 22% more than 2019, and the most by far in the country. In 2020, 50% of the nation's venture capital went to California, double the next 3 states, New York, Massachusetts, and Texas combined. There have been about 750 venture funding rounds or an IPO at a valuation of over $1 billion, the so-called unicorns. 500 of those are in California. San Francisco alone has more unicorns than Texas, Florida, North Carolina, and Colorado combined. There are 17 unicorns in the entire southern United States, which tends to be the place that people think everything's happening. San Francisco had more than that created in the first quarter of 2021. There have only been 22 startups in the United States that were valued at $10 billion or more in a funding round, 22. 17 of those are in the Bay Area. And more generally in public companies, there are 236 public companies in Silicon Valley. They had a combined market cap a year ago, 4.75 trillion. Now it's over 8.5 trillion, 80% growth in 1 year in the middle of a pandemic recession. So the idea that California has suddenly become an unattractive place and businesses and people are fleeing is just not borne out by the facts.
Right. Just a good headline, I guess. But one thing we do hear from our businesses and our members frequently is that it's really difficult to do business in California in some respects. There are a lot of restrictions. It's very expensive. So is there something that you think the state can do to minimize the expense to keep it competitive and business friendly in California?
Yeah, I think that's a much more important issue. The California has been and probably always will be a more expensive place. It's a beautiful place to live. Yeah. There's a lot of economic opportunity. We have very clearly made a decision that we're going to be a high standard state in terms of labor or regulations, wages, minimum wages, et cetera, as well as we really do believe that climate change is real and need to be on top of ensuring that we are not growing by adding more energy or carbon to the energy into the environment or carbon into the air. And so it is going to be an expensive place, but it is an expensive place more than it should be for some things like, most importantly, which honestly is the reason most people, if they leave California because it's too expensive, leave, is because housing costs too much. And the reason that costs too much is because we're not building enough housing. The reason that we have a more expensive state to live in when you're spending 50% of your income on housing is because the housing costs too much. So the way to help make California more competitive for people to be able to afford to live here, and more competitive for businesses to be able to hire people, is fundamentally build more housing. That's extremely difficult in a locally controlled environment where the trifecta of NIMBYs and anti-growth environmental activity and some expensive labor and CEQA make this really difficult to do. But we've got to address that issue or we're not going to deal with the competitiveness. And then lastly, and I was starting to spend time on this when I had to leave the administration for health reasons. It is too complicated to do many business activities, particularly opening a new business and then thinking about how to expand. And that's in part because multiple levels of government and multiple agencies have to approve things. If we could simplify and streamline that into a single stop to get what you need to open, and a way to navigate that doesn't lower standards, but it's kind of like in a business setting, more clean sheet or leaning out our approval processes, it would really help. I mean, it's part of the reason housing costs too much and we're not building enough, because it just takes too long to get the permitting done. Time is money, even in low interest rate environments, and we really need to do something about that. It, by the way, is something that I actually think has been done in some local jurisdictions much better than others. And it's something that I think in local communities that are really trying to attract business can make a difference on. And it's something that I think business leaders in those communities who are interested and willing to dive deep into that can make a difference with the city and county planning activities if they engage in it, not in a, regulations suck, it's horrible here, but in a let's problem solve together to streamline this. A lot of those skills are business skills that are not as evident in many of our regulatory and permitting agencies.
Do you have any predictions for what emerging industries will be moving out of COVID and into the next decade? Where do you see businesses popping up now?
As I mentioned a little bit ago, they're popping up everywhere. Part of them are not very visible because they're small yet, and there's a huge amount of venture investment supporting many of them. Trying to predict that in specificity is a little bit like the Bureau of Labor Statistics trying to predict what the next job growth categories are going to be. When you go look back every 10 years at what was the fastest job growth categories, it's always not elsewhere classified, something we didn't know about 10 years ago. So having said that, I do think there's some fundamental things that are going to be important for the next while here that will drive economic value and growth. And a lot of them are places where there's substantial angel and venture funding in. One is the intersection of biotechnology and information technology. And we saw it in the development and deployment of the vaccines, but thinking about how we extend that into other areas and continue to be ahead of the curve on health, utilizing the information that's available, given the quantity of data and the ability to manipulate that, has some real potential. And if anything, in the Bay Area, there's not enough lab space for companies to do that kind of work. It's more concentrated in Southern California. There's some here, but there's an enormous investment and enthusiasm around space and satellite activity. I'm not just talking about SpaceX, even much more broadly, the opportunity to help have new kinds of innovations that come from low orbit satellite and other elements that come off of that for things like monitoring deforestation or carbon emissions, or low orbit broadband deployment at much lower cost. I think there's a lot of innovation that is happening and will happen there. And Southern California has a longstanding head start there and should continue to do that. I think there will be a set of very interesting innovations that come out of the application of information technology more generally to industries that have been less information technology intensive. If you haven't seen the videos of automated strawberry pickers, they're interesting. It's something that would not have physically been possible not very long ago, because you have to have a sensor that not only can see is the strawberry ripe, but is it at the right texture and color to be picked, and it's a machine doing it. And they're being deployed in early stages in Monterey and Salinas and in the Central Valley that I think have a lot of promise for information technology applied to agriculture, whether it's that kind of thing or in an environment where we're always going to be water uncertain. More efficient uses of water and the application of that to agriculture, I think will be important. I think more generally, the area of the largest and unfortunately too rapidly growing sector of the economy that has applications in healthcare. I think the pandemic taught us that a large portion of healthcare can be at least partially effectively delivered remotely. And in things like behavioral health, where there's a massive surplus of demand relative to our capacity to meet it, and the ability to do that in locations where there's not a availability of or immediate access to clinicians, I think can be dramatically aided by information technology that both enables remote delivery and service, but also remote diagnostics. So I do think those have a lot of potential as well. There are a lot of other sectors that is why I'm bullish about the California economy that have the potential to be enabled by a focus on ensuring that we have energy and carbon efficient growth, and that utilize technology to make them more productive in general. So, in an environment that there was not an industry 15 years ago, the single largest product export in the state of California last year was zero emission vehicles. And we're barely getting started. They'll be applied to buses, they'll be applied to trucks, those in a world where, the traditional view was that the automobile industry is dead, and Detroit is often used as what we don't want to become. We're building a new industry in California because it's information technology intensive. So I'm optimistic about all of that potential for innovation. And when there's technology underpinning a lot of them, I think there's a lot of opportunity in California.
Okay, great. I actually have just a couple more questions, and then I want to leave time for questions from our audience. So again, just a reminder, if you have questions, you're welcome to either raise your hand or put them in the chat room, and we'll get to you. But I'm just wondering, Lenny, what role does small business play in the emerging markets and in California and moving forward? Is there still a strong emphasis on small business in California?
Yeah, no question. It's the engine of growth. It's important, the engine of job creation. And in many of the sectors that I described, it's not just new companies and startups that enable them. It's the full ecosystem of how that industry works that are going to be essential for both the delivery of them, but the job creation that comes with it. So the aerospace satellite space business that I mentioned earlier is completely enabled by an extraordinarily robust and very diverse and broad spread ecosystem of small businesses in Southern California. They're not always obvious because they're specialized in what they do, but they're very unique. And that's an industry, particularly if it's got defense implications, that isn't going to be outsourced or done someplace else in the world. It needs to be there and needs to be proximate to where it's going. In addition, particularly as the hospitality, travel and tourism, the creative economy reemerges, many of those businesses are smaller businesses that have important roles to play in an economy, and particularly are valuable for large-scale job creation. In my view, we're not going to have a broad-based and inclusive economic recovery that has real job creation unless we have a very robust small business sector.
Mhm.
I'm also pleased, as much as I hated to see her leave California, that a woman that I had gotten to agree to be the head of California's Office of Small Business Advocate, Isabel Guzman from LA, has now joined the Biden administration as the administrator of Small Business Administration. Small business is one of those things that, in my experience at least, is an extraordinarily bipartisan enthusiasm. It was the one area when I was visiting legislators in California, even with the most, shall we say, less business-friendly legislators, they always wanted to talk about what can we do to help small business in my district.
Right.
And so I do think they're really important. And I think that chambers of commerce play a very important role in ensuring that they continue to have the visibility and awareness and support and removing obstacles to enable their continued success and growth. That's true at the city and county level, where frankly a lot of the most important challenges to starting and growing a business happen. You can't make that work without an active Chamber of Commerce voice in those settings. It's important that there is a small business voice more broadly than individual small businesses that are at the table when big legislation is considered at all different levels, particularly we need businesses to show up, chambers of commerce to show up in planning commissions and say, yes, build that housing. You need those voices, and you need to make sure that there's a continued voice that says, don't taxes out of existence. We need those kinds of voices if we're going to have a successful economy.
Sure. Well, thank you for that, because you just talked me out of my last question. You just answered it right there about what role do chambers of commerce play in supporting small businesses. So I appreciate you doing that. We have actually a couple of questions in the chat room. And the first one comes from Ravi Mayela. If I'm saying that appropriately, Ravi, I'm sorry. What's one instance or example that surprised you about Governor Newsom's outstanding leadership during your time working with him?
So I've known Governor Newsom for a long time, since he was mayor of San Francisco, worked with him quite a bit at that level and when he was lieutenant governor. So I know him reasonably well. But one of the things that if you only see him on TV or in large speaking environments, you don't notice, he comes across as a charismatic, great speaker, good-looking guy, all those kinds of things that lead you to believe that it's flash and he's not substantive. He's very public about this, and many people know it. The governor's dyslexic and taught himself to read and learn by having an enormous memory and intellectual capacity. He has the ability to retain information and connect dots from disparate points of view, different data sources, and willed that into, so what does that mean and what do we do about it? That is extraordinary. When you're working for him, you better make sure you know your numbers, because if you tell him a 3.25% growth one time and you come back the next time, it says it's 3.27, he's going to, I thought you said it was 3.25. That's the way he is. And then the part that, we were talking about it earlier. It would have been very easy in the early days of the pandemic to have the person who ultimately has to make those decisions on what are we going to do in the state about these, and that was him, to have it be driven by political voices in your ear, like do some polling or let's do some constituency and see what it looks like. That was not the way the decisions were made. In fact, I remember discreetly one conversation where one of the people in the room was describing how they'd communicated what his decision was. He said, you're describing it as though this is a campaign or a politics question. This is not a politics question. This is about life and death. And if you start talking that way again, you're not going to be in the room. We need to do the right things, and it's our challenge to figure out how to communicate to the people properly. I, if you're not in the room and don't hear those, you think that, yeah, that's not how it happens. It is how it happens. And, I thoroughly enjoyed my time working in government. If I had not had a health issue, I would still be there. And part of it is because I like working with people who are aspirational and like big challenges and set out big targets and say, you go figure out how to get it done. And that's definitely his leadership style. As you can tell, doesn't like to think small, and he doesn't like to think things aren't possible. And he doesn't like to think about you can only do one thing at a time. So I am sure he is intently frustrated, and as frustrated as everyone else about, isn't this pandemic done and we're all back open again so we can get on with all the things that we need to get on with. But that's, when you're in a leadership position, you get to play the hand you're dealt. You don't get to throw it back in and say, give me another one.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, but it's certainly true. Our next question comes from Corrine Winter, and the question is, what does the future of regional rail look like? High-speed rail, how is that important for businesses in the Fremont area?
So I do think one of the important implications of how work is spread around the region and the state is going to have implications for what our rail system looks like. You combine that with the urgency of dealing with climate change and ensuring that we're not putting more cars on the road, but we're trying to ensure that people get around rapidly and effectively. I do think rail is absolutely crucial, and I think it's really crucial, without making any comments in any, I don't have any official capacity, but I don't want to be on record anyway about merging different entities. We have way too complicated a rail system. And the more we can coordinate that through things like integrated passes and coordinated schedules and all those sorts of things, the better off we'll be. A rail system only works if you can get from point A to point B quickly and efficiently and reliably. And when that's done well, particularly in an environment where we are likely to have what I was describing in earlier, that not everyone's going to be commuting the same way 5 days a week and so you've got rush hour one way in the morning and another way at night. I think we're going to see a much more dispersed pattern. And that is terrific for the ability to have a rail system and zero emission bus system that connect people and going different ways at different times. You've got to have a schedule that works. You've got to have connectivity that works. And importantly for California, where a lot of that is and should be connected through the center part of the state and connecting the north and south, I think high-speed rail is fundamental to that. We are gonna need an ability to get people from different parts of the state to each other, and we're not going to do that either cost efficiently. We're not going to do it practically given the space constraints, and we're not going to do it in a way that isn't as carbon intensive by building more airports and expanding the capacity at those airports. Those should be international hubs and cross-country hubs, not intra-California hubs. And I do think rail is fundamentally important. I think you'll see a whole new burst of enthusiasm around that when you have rail dollars coming from an infrastructure plan in Washington, D.C. I also think you'll see more enthusiasm about it when people start to get comfortable and we're getting vaccination rates very high and herd immunity up, and the investments in airflow and safety within the rail system so that they're reliable and safe. So I'm a big fan, and I think it's really, really important for the workforce and for businesses in Fremont and the entire Bay Area. And in fact, I think what we will see as this plays out in the next couple of decades, we will have a mega region connected that way that creates a lot more opportunity for people in where they could, when high-speed rail is completed, it will be faster to get from Fresno to San Jose than it today takes to drive from San Jose to San Francisco. Imagine what that does to how you think about the economic footprint and the labor workforce, and how you think about that if you only have to do that 1 or 2 days a week as opposed to 5 days a week. I just think it's going to be a very different environment, and I'm excited about it. If you've ever ridden on really high quality rail systems, let alone high speed rail in Europe or in Japan or Russia, as I've done, it's astounding and really, really terrific. And I just think part of it is it's embarrassing that the state of California doesn't have, or the United States more broadly, doesn't have that quality and speed and scale of rail connectivity that other parts of the world do.
Yeah, I think our transportation network here is really not good, and that we would benefit so much from something like that. I'm excited about the possibility of that for sure. We are just about out of time. And again, Lenny, I want to thank you. You have been a wealth of information, and I'm hoping that maybe we can convince you to come back again down the road a little bit when things start to recover and be able to take another look at what's in our future here. But I thank you so much for your time and being with us here today. I also want to thank our sponsors, which is Kaiser Permanente, Facebook, and Washington Hospital, for making this possible for us and so many of the things we do. And thank our guests for being part of this. So please, Lenny, take care, and we hope we see you again soon. Thanks so much, everyone.
Great. Thanks for the invitation. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.